And again, I record these not so that you go back and watch the whole thing over again, but so that you can look at things that maybe you want to review a little more, want to review again, whatever. So you wouldn't look at the whole lecture, right? Okay? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at process costing. Now, we said for job order costing, we have our what? Our product cost that we track by job. We have our direct labor, our direct materials. Our manufacturing overhead is one of our product costs, one of our manufacturing costs, but we had to apply that to jobs, and we used some sort of driver, like direct labor hours, something like that. Okay, we are going to still have to apply our manufacturing overhead to our through process costing, but now instead of applying the cost to each job, we're going to apply our costs, including our direct costs, to departments. Okay, so we're going to break our manufacturing into various departments, and then we're going to apply our cost, our overhead, we'll apply that, our direct costs, our labor, and our materials to each department. Okay, now this is going to apply to industries that produce homogeneous product. Okay, so what happens? You can't really distinguish one box of cornflakes from the other, right? They all look the same. All the cornflakes themselves look the same, right? So we use process costing for something like that, where one item doesn't really differentiate from the other. Now, sometimes students will say, well, wait a minute, what if we're producing frosted flakes and cornflakes? Well, that's a different what? That's a different product, right? Okay, so in that situation, we would, even though we'd still use process costing, now we're capturing our cost for frosted flakes versus cornflakes. You know, frosted flakes, the ones that have the sugar on them already. Okay, all right, so that's what we're going to be doing here. And if we're talking about how we would take our costs, we would go and take our costs, direct labor, direct materials, manufacturing overhead, to each processing department. So if we're going to continue to use the cornflakes example here, maybe we have a flake department and we have a boxing department, right? So flake department is where they make all the flakes, and then they conveyor belt over to the boxing department where they stuff them into the box, right? Okay, so we'll kind of use that analogy as we go through. Of course, once we have completed our product in that last processing department, for our little example, say the boxing department, then they go to finished goods inventory, out of finished goods to cost of goods sold, and that's the same as what we talked about for job order costing. Okay? Okay, so we're going to use this example. We're going to use T accounts, journal entries, to basically see how we would use journal entries to track these costs through the system, right? This is something that probably distinguishes this class a little bit more from how it would be taught in the managerial level, and that I would not focus as much on journal entries. Here, since this isn't a part of your accounting major, I will focus on journal entries, expect you to understand the journal entries in this process. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look, and we start with our raw materials, and notice we take our direct materials to each department. So if we're talking about raw materials for, say, the flake department, it's the, I don't know, the corn mash, I don't know, the water, the milk, the eggs, whatever it is that they use to make the flakes, okay? That's all going to be part of our flake department, right? In the box department, the raw materials are the cardboard boxes, that little piece of plastic they put inside, that wax paper stuff they put inside, etc., right? Okay, so we would issue those direct materials to each of our processing departments. Then we have labor, okay? In the flake department, maybe we have, did you ever see those little Willy Wonka, those little Oompa Loompa guys, right? Maybe all those guys are sitting there hitting the big old, it makes a big old flake, and they have to hit the flake to make it into little flakes, okay? Whatever, okay? We have to have somebody that sits there and mixes the bowl of cornmeal, whatever it is. All of that would be direct labor in the flake department. In the box department, it's the guy that sits there and folds the boxes. Maybe when they come over, they're completely flat. He folds them, puts the wax paper in there, and he's responsible for scooping the stuff in, closing the box. I don't know. Whatever the direct labor would be for our two departments. Then when we get to our manufacturing overhead, we have our what? Our actual overhead, which is going to be, what are the items that go into overhead? Caught you napping. Caught you napping again, didn't I? What are the items that are going to go into overhead? Okay, supervisor salary, taxes. What do we call supervisor salary? Good. Indirect labor, indirect materials, I don't know, grease to run the machines, whatever. And then the others, remember the others are things like our depreciation, our taxes, that sort of thing, right? Okay, good. So same elements instead, and then we will apply them to, and instead of applying to them to jobs, we will apply them to our departments, but the process of applying them is the same that we did for job order costing, which is what? We'll use the high-low method to estimate what we think our overhead is going to be. We'll divide that by whatever we think the driver is going to be. That'll give us a predetermined overhead rate, and we'll apply it now to the departments instead of the jobs as they incur whatever the driver is, say direct labor hours, etc., right? Okay, so it'll still get to the departments using the same process, but instead of going to each job, it's going to the departments, right? Okay, good. So then, as we complete the flakes, and this is about as good as my graphic stuff gets, right? I mean, this is a big moment for me when I got this to show like this, which is what? We credit whatever is in work in process as it is finished, and we debit it to work in process and say the flake department, we credit it there, then we debit it to what? The box department. So now all those costs that were captured in the flake department are now transferred over to the boxing department, right? And then those are added to all the costs that were already in Department B, the boxing, as they put the flakes into the box. And then what? And then as the stuff is finished, it comes out of the last department, in our case, the boxing department, and into finished goods, right? Yes, sir.
I got a question. So when you meet Department A and Department B, they follow each other, right? So it goes from A and then B.
Yeah, we have a first processing department, a second processing department. I mean, we could have hundreds of processing departments, right?
So it's consecutive.
Yes, yeah, because you can't, I mean, what are you going to put in the box in the boxing department, right? You've got to put the flakes in there, so the flakes have to be transferred to that second department, the boxing department. That doesn't mean that we have to wait until we have the flakes to start to accumulate cost in Department B. We could be accumulating the cost in there, waiting for more stuff to come in from Department A, right? The flake department. Okay. Now notice some terms are exactly the same as what we said for job order costing. So our direct materials, direct labor, our applied overhead are all called what? Manufacturing cost. Okay. As we finish something, we take the cost of goods manufactured out of that, and that's only going to come out of the last processing department, because by definition, whatever we take out of work in process and goes into finished goods is cost of goods manufactured, right? So cost of goods manufactured can only come out of that last processing department. Okay? Question? Okay, good. And then, of course, we all know that cost of goods sold is whatever comes out of our finished goods inventory and into, our cost of goods sold. All right? Okay, good. Sorry for the weird, I forgot to hide the reveal codes, I guess, on this, whatever. But which of the following companies would most likely use a process costing system? Okay, let's go from the bottom. How about a law firm? Every case is different, right? If we have a case for murder versus jaywalking, that's going to be a much different, okay, set of costs, right? So that's going to be unique. How about a furniture manufacturer? For the most part, I mean, I guess if you were manufacturing the desks in this class, okay, that maybe you could use a process costing, but often furniture items are seen as unique, right? We're going to make this chest of drawers for you, etc. So furniture is not the best answer here. Shipbuilder, a cruise liner versus a battleship is going to be completely different, right? And so you look at the correct choice here, utility producing natural gas. What? Natural gas is what? Just one tank of natural gas after the other. There's really no differentiation. You may say, well, some tanks are bigger than the other. Well, that's all right. We'll just account for how much gas went into whatever tank, right? But the actual production of the gas would be a process costing. Okay? The answer is A. Yeah, because gas is, homogeneous product, right? And you say, well, why would you need more than one department for gas? Does natural gas have a smell to it? It does after they put the smell in it. Natural gas has no odor. That's why it is very dangerous, because it's deadly, isn't it? And if they don't put that smell in where everybody goes, oh, natural gas, run. They have to put that smell in it. It doesn't have that smell. They put that rotten egg smell in there after they've produced the gas. So we'd have the gas department, we'd have the stink department, I guess, right? And so we would process that through. The departments use it process costing. Okay? Okay, good. Which of the following products is least likely to be produced in a process costing operation? Well, now it's items that are what? Unique, are not going to be in process costing, right? So this is sort of the inside out version of the last question. Okay? So what happens? Compact discs. I'm going to have to update this because you guys probably don't even know what CDs are anymore, right? The discs, okay, which we used to put music on and information on and stuff, okay, now you probably say, look, Mom, mini Frisbees, okay? All right, so now I got to explain what a Frisbee is, okay? Frisbee was this big circle that we used to throw in the air at each other. Oh, okay. All right, so, huh?
Outdoor activities. Frisbee are outdoor activities. Frisbee.
Could be outdoors, but if you live in a bad neighborhood like I did, you played it indoors, though. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so I'm just kidding. Okay, so what happens? We have what? We have compact discs. They're pretty much homogeneous. Slacks. They're pretty much homogeneous, right? Baseball hats. Yeah, I mean, if you compare a Giants hat to an A's hat, other than the color, they're pretty much the same thing, right? Okay. Calculators, yeah, you say, well, wait a minute, what about a scientific calculator versus one with not scientific? Well, that's going to be a different batch, whatever, right? But those calculators that are all that type of calculator are exactly the same, right? Custom cabinets, what happens? The most important thing here is the word custom. That means that you made it special, doesn't it? Okay, so if you have something like a custom cabinet, a custom boat that's being made, something like that, that's going to be job order, not process. Okay, all right, let's look at this. As I said, we're going to consider journal entries in this class. So which of the following journal entries would be used to record application of manufacturing overhead to work in process in a process costing system with two processing departments, Department A, Department B? Okay, now, you are not ever, say proper English, you will never debit manufacturing overhead and credit work in process. That's nonsense. Okay, it is always going to be what? A credit to the manufacturing overhead, right? That's the applied. Okay, so you can immediately get rid of choice A there. Now, you're not going to have a debit that goes to one and a credit that goes to another department when you're trying to apply the overhead. So you can pretty much do what? Get rid of C and D. Okay, what happens? We apply the overhead to each department's work in process. Okay, however that works. By the way, well, let's just look at this example. So here's the actual side, right? Here's the applied side. And then we would do what? We would credit the applied. We would debit the work in process by department, right? Okay, now, in this class, at this stage for our first midterm, okay, I'm going to assume a factory-wide, let me go back to this overhead slide, a factory-wide overhead rate. Okay, there could be by department overhead rates, right? Because what happens? The Department A, see this person plugging this plug in? Okay. Department A maybe relies much more. The biggest driver of indirect costs is electricity, because maybe we've got all these mixing bowls and we've got the big old flake. And by the way, when they're making cornflakes, it really works that way. They have one big flake that they make, and then they sit there and they shake. The machine shakes it and cracks it into those little delicious little bite-sized flakes. Okay, and so that might use up a lot of electricity, right? So maybe the appropriate thing to use in our Department A, our flake department, is what? Is kilowatt hours to apply. And so we would use whatever the rate was using kilowatt hours. Maybe by the time we get to the boxing department, because it's mainly people scooping up the flakes and putting them in the box and folding the boxes up, maybe direct labor becomes the appropriate driver. And so we would have a different overhead application rate for our flake department versus our boxing department. So you can have by department rates. You can have a factory-wide rate. For our first midterm, I will always assume a factory-wide rate. When we get to chapter, I think it's chapter 7, activity-based costing, we start thinking about rates. We'll review the factory-wide. We'll start thinking about rates by department. We'll talk about rates by activity. So then we'll sit there and we'll have a rate that we will use to apply based on how much that product actually used up that particular activity. Okay, and that's probably pretty as sophisticated as they get these days. Most companies will probably use a department by department rate or a factory-wide rate, because remember, if we over or under apply our overhead at the end of any period, we simply do what? We simply adjust it by taking it either all to cost of goods sold or by allocating it between cost of goods sold, work in process, and finished goods. So you can always correct your misapplication, if you will, at the end of the accounting period by making that adjustment. Okay? Okay, good. Let's take a look at this one. Grayson Manufacturing incurred $17,000 for. I don't give you true or false questions on your exam. It'll always be multiple choice. Okay, I'm not going to give you true or false questions, but I put this one up anyway, just for practice. If Grayson Manufacturing incurred $17,400 direct labor in the assembly department and $10,300 for direct labor in the painting department, the journal entry to record the labor is going to be what? Although it would be by department, it's going to be a debit to the work in process, and for labor, it's going to be a credit to what? Salaries payable, not raw materials. This would be appropriate for what? For direct materials, wouldn't it? Okay, so this is false. Okay, equivalent units. Okay, and in this first set of information, we're going to look at equivalent units using the weighted average method. After we go through the weighted average method, we'll go through Fifo. Now, the biggest problem that I have, guys, when I look at this stuff is I can't seem to hold them both in my head at the same time. Okay? As soon as I'm cool with weighted average, I look at Fifo, and I'm cool with Fifo, and then I forget how weighted average worked. Okay? So your trick is going to be to somehow go beyond where I am able to at my advanced stage in life here and hold both of those in your head at the same time. Okay? Because on the exam, I will test you on both methods, okay? But let's talk about weighted average first, okay? And we talk about this concept of equivalent units. So what happens? They tell us that we have 10,000 units, and they tell us that they are 70% complete. So what we do is we give ourselves credit for the work that we have done this period. So on an equivalent unit basis, we would be saying that we actually have produced what? 7,000 units this period. Because what? We weren't completely done with the 10,000? Okay, so you take a look. I don't know what the difference. What's the difference between these two slides? I'm trying to figure it out. Other than the fact that this one explodes out at you. Okay, but other than that, it's the same slide, isn't it? Okay. All right, so you come over, and let's look at this example. And so we have what? We have 10,000 units that were completed. On an equivalent unit basis, though, how many units have we completed? And so we would have to take the 5,000 units that were in process. We multiply that by the 30% they said they're done. So we give ourselves credit for having completed what? 1,500? You take the 10,000 that we have completed 100% plus the 1,500 on an equivalent units basis. So that means the answer here is what? 11,500. Okay. Okay. Now, as I've said, we're going to talk about both weighted average and Fifo. We'll talk about weighted average first, then we'll talk about Fifo. Okay. And Fifo is in a separate file. Okay. So, when we use weighted average, the two main things that you need to remember, okay, is we give ourselves credit for all the work done on beginning inventory in the current period, regardless as to whether or not some of that work was done in the previous period. Okay, so if they tell you in a problem that the units were 20% complete at the start of the period, your temptation is going to be, well, that means we completed 80% of the work this period. Weighted average, you assume that you did 100% of the work in this period. You assume that you did 100% of that work in this period. Okay. The other important thing about weighted average is that we gather the costs that are both in beginning inventory and the current period costs in computing our weighted average cost per equivalent unit. Okay, those are the two big things. All right, so let's just take a look, and we can see that we had what? 300 units that were in process, and at the start of the period they were 40% complete as to materials. They were 20% complete as to conversion costs. Remember, conversion costs are what? Direct labor and overhead, right? Okay, now they give you these percentages in problems that are weighted average problems simply to distract you, simply to mess you up, because we do not pay attention to how many of these units were actually finished or were actually had work done on them. How much work was actually done on these units in this period? We just assume that we did all the work in the current period. Okay. Now, we have units started into production is 6,000, and often the problem will tell you units started and completed. If the problem tells you that, then it's a piece of cake. You simply do what? You simply take the 5,100 units started and completed plus the 300. That will give you the units that were completed and transferred out. Okay, if they give that to you. Some problems don't give that to you. Some problems will say there were 6,000 units started, and it's up to you to figure out the units started and completed. Therefore, would be the units that I started minus what? The units that are in ending inventory. That means that I would have started and completed what? 5,100. So some problems give you that 5,100. They'll just say the unit started and completed. That's an easier problem because you simply take that number plus your equivalent units to get your equivalent units. If they don't tell you that, then they would have to tell you how many units were started. They have to tell you how many units were in ending inventory. So now you know that you did what? You started and completed 5,100 units, and then what? You also completed the 300 that were in beginning inventory, so that gives you the 5,400. Okay? Okay, so let's just take a look. Units completed and transferred out to the department, out of the department in June were 5,400. Okay, remember our conversion cost of direct labor, manufacturing overhead. You go ahead and you add the equivalent units, and you have to pick up the percentage for our materials versus our conversion costs, right? We had two different percentages. Materials, in most cases, are further along than conversion cost, aren't they? There's some product, I can't think of any, where maybe the labor goes in before the materials come in. But I kind of picture people, dancing in front of nothing if they're doing labor before the materials are there. But if that was the case, then you could be further along for labor. But usually your materials are going to be further along than your labor, right? Okay. And then we go ahead, bring in those equivalent units. We have the equivalent unit for our materials for our conversion costs. That's it, guys. That's the equivalent units. Weighted average. You simply what? Give yourself credit. Notice we did what? We started and completed 5,100 units, didn't we? That's that highlighted part. Okay, but we transferred out what? Units completed and transferred out 5,400 because there was 300 in beginning inventory, weren't there? Okay, so you could see that differently in some questions. They'll just tell you units started and they'll just tell you the units started and completed were 5,100. You add all of the beginning inventory to get the units transferred out, and then you bring in the equivalent units. If they don't tell you that, they may tell you the units started. Then you're going to have to do what? Subtract the units in ending inventory to get the units started and completed. It just simply depends on what information we give you in that problem. Question? Okay. Okay, good. Now we have to pick up the cost. We've got our equivalent units. We have to pick up our cost, and under weighted average, we only pick up the cost. We pick up the cost both in what? Both in beginning inventory and the cost added for the period. So we pick up the cost in beginning inventory and the costs that were added for the period. Okay, so you take a look and we pick up both of these. I put a star on this slide, very important. We've already seen how to do the equivalent units. Cost of beginning work in process, cost added during the period, right? That's how we come up with the equivalent cost per unit, cost per equivalent unit. And so we pick up these costs, materials, conversion. Notice it's both the beginning and the cost added for the period, right? Gives us the total. We divide that by the equivalent units. That gives us an equivalent cost per unit, and we have one cost per unit for our materials, one for our conversion cost, our labor, and our overhead, right? If you wanted a total, you could add those together, but typically what we do is we just apply them separately. Okay, but you could have a total cost. But typically I'll ask you in questions, what is it for material, what is it for labor? Okay. Okay, good. Now we're going to go ahead and assign the cost to my various elements. So I have my cost per equivalent unit. My ending work in process is what? 540,270 on an equivalent unit basis. That came from the previous slide. I apply the cost per unit. That means that the value of my ending work in process is going to be 11,340 plus 4050. 15,390 is the total that would be left in work in process. Okay. The costs that are transferred out are what? Are 5,400 units transferred out, which we saw from the previous slide, times what? Times my equivalent cost per units, and that's the cost that I transfer out, 194,400. Okay, now they give you this little worksheet here. It came with this text as to how to check your figures. Okay, I'm going to point to you a different approach. Okay, this cost that you come up with, cost for the ending inventory, the way they present it here, it's like it's the most important number in this calculation. And my thought on this number is it's a check figure. It's a check figure for you to look back and see that you have the right amount as the ending balance in your work in process, right? Because if it is, then that means you figured out the correct cost to transfer out, haven't you? Okay. The most important is this number right here. What is the cost that I've transferred out of my work in process for the period? Okay, that's really the number that you have to have. This number comes for free. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about here. So we had beginning costs in our work in process, and I put them all together now. I didn't separate them by materials versus overhead. It doesn't, versus conversion, because it doesn't make any difference. 10,039 was the total cost that were in process at the beginning of the period, right? Just going back. 10,039 were the total costs that were sitting in there, right? In work in process. Don't start looking to somebody to help you. If you have a question, look here. Don't start trying to draw the attention away from somebody who's understanding to explain it to you. Is there a question? Okay, so we have what? 10,000. I don't understand why students always want to do that. The person next to them is understanding, and then they start to sit there and go, let me distract that person from their understanding so they can teach me, rather than stopping the train and saying, what the hell are we talking about? Okay, so is there a question? Okay, so we've got what? 10,039 is the total cost that we're sitting in there at the beginning, right? Work in process. 10,039, that's the beginning balance. Then what? Then we added 199,751 of cost for the period. Again, going back to that other slide, we were added the 199,751. Those costs were added for this period. Okay, bringing us up to what? A total cost that were in there of 209,790. Okay, which is the balance when you look here that's in this work in process, 209,790. That's the total cost that had gotten in there. Then what? Then we transferred the cost out, and we transferred the cost out using our equivalent units per a cost per equivalent unit, didn't we? Right? Cost per equivalent unit for our items that were transferred out was 194,400. So that stuff's going to come out of, and it'll either come out of process department A and into process department B, or it's coming out of process department B and into finished goods, right? All we know is we're going to transfer those costs out here. Okay? So when we transfer those costs out, we do what? We debit either the next department's work in process or our finished goods for 194,400. We credit the work in process, right? And when we do, it's left with a balance of 15,390. Right here. Is that the balance that's left? And that was the balance that we calculated should be in our work in process at the end of the year using our equivalent unit per a cost per equivalent unit times the number of equivalent units that were in there, even though we calculated them separately here for materials and for conversion costs. I just showed you rather than have two separate sets of numbers going into our work in process, I just use it for one big number. Question? Yes, sir. Yeah, those were the equivalent units, 540 and 270, which we had gotten when we applied the relative percentages to the total number of units that were in process.
And those percentages came from the problem, right?
Yeah, we would have to have our engineers, whatever, tell us how far along we thought we were. I mean, it's not up to the, again, it could be up to the accountant to go in and look to see, but I'm thinking some production person would say, yeah, we were 60% done as to materials, and, we had done 30% of the labor on that stuff that's still, you see those flakes that are still sitting in the mixing bowl? Yeah. Well, those are about 60% done as to materials and about 30% done as to labor. Thank you. So, and there's about 900 worth of units sitting in there. And so we go ahead and we just apply those percentages to those different things, right? So we're saying on an equivalent unit basis, right, we've got 500, we've got 540 units as to materials. We've got 270 units as to labor, right? And so then when we come up with that equivalent cost per unit, okay, that we calculated right here, right? Then we go ahead and we assign it to the ending inventory here, right? Using those equivalent units in the ending inventory. And, you know, the way they present it here, it looks like this is the number you care about. This number, to me, is the number that should be left over if I do my what? If I do my correct journal entry to transfer the stuff out using the equivalent units. And the correct entry would be to do what? Would be to sit there and credit the work in process in Department A or Department B, debit either finished goods or Department B's work in process, and that's the number that should be left over as I've taken my beginning work in process and added my cost incurred for the period, right? And that worked. That was the number that was left. And in this example, I debited finished goods. I assumed this was my last processing department. Okay? Where am I going to report finished goods? Where would I report finished goods? Well, what word comes at the end of the phrase finished goods? Huh? Finished goods, and then there's another word that comes at the end of that phrase. No, huh? Finished goods inventory. Finished goods inventory, right? This is stuff that I've finished that I'm waiting to sell, isn't it? These are cornflakes that are sitting on the shelf of Kellogg's, whatever. Okay, so where does finished goods inventory show up? Okay, this is an accounting class, right? Is this an accounting class? Okay, so we have a balance sheet, we have an income statement, we have a statement of retained earnings, we have a statement of cash flows, right? I mean, isn't that why God put you on earth now, right? God put you on earth so that in the future there will be balance sheets produced, there will be income statements produced, there will be statement of cash flows produced, there will be statement of retained earnings produced. That's why you're here now, isn't it? So you have to know the names of your children, don't you? So where does inventory show up?
Balance sheet.
Is it that hard of a question? Did I have to have one person that can answer it? Where does inventory show up? I'm sorry? Where does inventory show up? On the balance sheet. Good. Okay, so we'll put our finished goods on our balance sheet, right? How about work in process? Balance sheet. So we don't have to, but we may report what? Production in process versus finished goods. We don't have to. We could just call it all inventory. Okay? But I'm pointing this out because what? We are still in financial reporting mode here, aren't we? The only difference between this and your 301, your 302 class, 301, 302 is all about, well, FASB says that we have to report the fully diluted and primary earnings per share, so here's how you calculate the fully diluted and primary earnings per share. In this class, we're doing what? We're saying, look, the inventory was not already acquired like it was under in a retail entity like we assume in 301, 302. Here we are doing what? We're producing the inventory and we're tracking the cost through the system here, right? Okay, so when we sell this stuff, what do? When Kellogg sells the cornflakes to Safeway, what journal entry will be made? Huh? Credit finished goods and debit what? Debit the cost of goods sold? Okay, good. All right? Okay, good. Look, guys, if you don't like participating in the class, what I can do is just, have you read the slides, and I'll just sit on the side and ask you if you're done reading them, and I'll just change the slide. I mean, if that's the way you want to do it. Okay, I'm assuming that you took this class because you want to have a dialogue about this stuff and understand this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to continue to push you in that direction. Let me know when you're ready to, just have me put the slides on auto narration, and I'll just let them run. And once they've all run, I'll say, okay, class dismissed, right? Okay? All right, so let's take a look at a couple questions here. We've got this Fabian Corporation uses the weighted average method. The assembly department started the month with 9,000 units in beginning work in process inventory that were 70% complete with respect to conversion costs. An additional 90,000 units were transferred from the prior department during the period to begin processing in the assembly department. During the month, 87,000 units were completed. Stop. If that question gives you that, you don't need to worry about the rest of that step. You know what number of units got completed, right? So you know those were transferred out. So notice in the solution here, we picked out that 87,000, we put it down, right? But we want to know what is the equivalent unit, so we have to figure out what's going on for these, 12,000 units in ending work in process, 12,000 units in ending work in process times they tell us they were 20% complete. On an equivalent unit basis, we completed 2,400 units. Okay, so we don't need to sit up here and say, well, let's see, 9,000 units, and how much of that was done this period? They just simply what? They simply give this to me, right? Okay? Okay, good. Now you come over and you take a look at this problem here, and they tell me that the units completed and transferred to the next department during October were 37,100. If I see that, I know those units were completed, right? So I pick that up, and then I simply add the equivalent units to beginning inventory. Ending inventory. 9,600 times 80% complete. Okay. Now, that means that I have 44,780 units here, right? Okay, to answer this question. But let's take a look and see how we could have gotten this 37,100 if they didn't give it to me. So what I would do is pick up the units that were transferred from the other department. Then I'm going to go ahead and do what? Subtract out the units that weren't completed yet. And if I add in then the 6,6 beginning inventory, that gives me 37,100, doesn't it? Okay, because I know I would have completed those units this period and transferred them out. This question just gave it to me, so I didn't have to calculate that. No difference here, just you see the official solution here. Okay, all right, good. Let's look at this one, and what are the total equivalent units for direct materials? Okay, so they give me the units completed and transferred out at 4,000. You pick that number up, just looking at the solution, times what? Times the 3,000 units in ending inventory times 80%, it's 2,400, right? So it's a pretty easy question. If they didn't give that to me, I would have to do what? 7,000 units started, 3,000 units in ending inventory. That means I what? That means I started and completed 4,000. And in this case, there was nothing in beginning inventory, so I would just have to add 0 or do nothing. I'd still get to 4,000, wouldn't I? Okay, let's look at this problem. It's maybe looks a little more scary than it is. Okay, so what happens? Here they want the cost per equivalent unit for conversion cost. Okay, now this one is a little bit different because notice they do not give me the units started and completed. So I'm going to have to work for that number, right? Okay, so what do? I get the units started. I subtract out what? The beginning work in process, because what happens, the units started in production were not the units that were, the units that were in ending, right? I haven't I'm looking for started and completed, right? So even though I started those, I did not complete them. So I have to work for this 67,000. I take the 86,000 minus the 19. 67,000 is the unit started and completed, right? Okay. Then I go ahead and I do what? Huh? Well, then I go ahead and I take the 24,000 units that were in beginning inventory because that gives me the equivalent units because I assume I completed all of those this period. So that's how I got the 91,000. Okay. So again, just so we saw in those other ones, units started minus the ending inventory gives me units started and completed. And then I go ahead and get what? I add in the beginning inventory to get the units completed this period, right? Because I give myself credit for everything being, I assume it was all done this period, right? Okay, so that gives me the 91,000. Then I pick up my cost, and I pick up what? I pick up all the costs, don't I? Those in beginning inventory and those added for the period. Okay, so I take what? 68,064 plus the 585,234. That's 653,388. 650,388 divided by my equivalent units of, after I got the 91,000, guys, I had to do what? I had to pick up the equivalent units for the ending inventory, which means I had to pick up the 19,000 units in ending inventory that were 20% done. I misspoke. I said 91,000 was equivalent units, but I forgot to add in the ending inventory. Okay, the percent done. So my equivalent units was 94.8. So I take all the costs, those in beginning inventory plus those that were added for the period. That gives me 653,388, and I divide that by the equivalent units, 94,800. And that gives me equivalent unit, a cost per equivalent unit of 6.8922784. Which does what? Which rounds to 6892. The answer to this question? Now you sit there and you say, okay, John, why did you put all those silly numbers in there? Because I'm going to go a step further with this, and I'm going to go ahead and in T-account form show us the journal entries for these transfers of these costs, right? Okay. So just looking at my work in process, right up here in the right-hand corner, I started with 68,064, didn't I? I added what? 585,324 to bring me up to a balance of 653,388. And then I take what? I take my equivalent units that were transferred here, which were, where'd they go now? 94,800. Where's that calculation? I'm having trouble following my own calculations here. The not 94,800, but the 91,000 units that were transferred, that we assume got transferred. 91,000, and you have to use that big old number in order for this to work. That's why I calculated that number. 91,000 units were completed and transferred out, weren't they? That 91,000. So I take that times the 6.8922784. I transfer out costs of $627,197.33. So I do what? I credit work in process, and I guess I debit finished goods if this was the last processing department. And I'm left with cost of what? 26,190.67. So I check that figure by doing what? By taking the 3,800, I should say, equivalent units, which I wrote right here, 3,800 equivalent units times that big old number. Yeah, pretty close, right? For the ending inventory number? Pretty close. A few cents off. Hey, it's not going to be perfect. It's 2 cents off, 1 cent off, whatever.
So you wouldn't do the 94,000 times 6.89? The 91,000?
No. 94,800 is the sum of the units that got transferred plus the equivalent units, okay, of 3,800. But that's not the number of. That's not what's left in work in process. What's left in work in process, those units are still left in work in process, aren't they? I just gave myself credit for how much work I had done on them in this period, but they're not finished goods. I'm not assuming that I transferred them out. I'm saying they're still in work in process and they're this far done. Okay, so the only units that went out of work in process to finished goods were the units actually completed and transferred out of, in this case, my last processing department into finished goods, right? So that's the 91,000. That's why it's not 94,800. Because for 3,800 units, I still have those units in work in process, right? And you say, well, what do you mean 3,800 units? Didn't you say you finished those? Yeah, I finished that much. If you look at it, it's a mess. It's a bunch of mixed up gobbledygook. But I'm saying, well, they're this much done, even though they're still in work in process. Okay? Stay away from that number. Watch out when we're using weighted average. You stay away from whatever the percentage completion they gave you of the beginning inventory, right? We assume we did all that work this period. How do you avoid a shark attack? Leave them alone. You know, I was to see these people that say, oh, well, we're going to learn how to avoid shark attack. And then they go in the water and they get in a tank and they go, the shark. And they say, oh, and the shark starts pouncing at the cage. I'm like, well, now to avoid this, you should really have done this. I'm like, how about just leave it alone? Okay, and it won't attack you. If you really want to avoid shark attack, just don't go in the water. Okay, so leave it alone, and it won't attack you. You just go just walk by the water. Don't look at it. It'll leave you alone. Okay? Now that doesn't work for pit bulls. Does not work for pit bulls, okay? They like to come over to you regardless, okay? All right. But it is a pit bull, right? I mean, don't mess with it. Okay? Okay, good. Now you come over, and one more equivalent units calculation, guys. We had what? Units finished and transferred out, 5,000. That's our number. 5,000 plus what? Plus our, oh, well, this is one where they what? They tell me the units finished and transferred out, and then what? There were 900 units of product in department. There, at the beginning of the recent period, there were 900 units of the product in department, 35% complete. Yeah, this is why, sorry. This is why I'm pointing this one out, because the wording is a little different. Then they tell us these units were finished, and then an additional what? 5,000 units. So this question reads a little bit differently, right? So sometimes the reading comprehension issue comes in on these, and that you have to read the question carefully. So here you have to do what? Add those units that were in beginning inventory to get to the units completed and transferred out, just based on how they worded the problem. And then you can go ahead and add in your equivalent units. The inventory was 25% done at the end of the period, so you take the 800 units times the 25%. Yeah, I know. You wanted to be an accountant. I always get students go, class is boring. Meanwhile, you became an accounting major. What do you want me to do about it? Huh?
The 5,000 and the 900 add each other. The other one is 800 times 25%.
Those are the items in ending inventory, right? Yeah. The wording in this question is a little different from some of the others we saw, right? Because for the others, to get the units completed and transferred out, we were doing what? We were having to sit there and subtract the ending inventory from the units started and then add the beginning. Here, the way they worded it, they told you there were 900 units that were in production. Those were completed and transferred out, plus another 5,000 units were completed and transferred out. In that case, you have to add those two numbers together, and you don't have to worry about making the adjustment for ending inventory. Okay? Okay, good. Let's take a look at this one. And beginning inventory work in process, 200 units. Ending work in process, 80% complete, 400 units. Total units started during the year, 3,200. Okay, so we take the beginning plus the units started. We're 3,200. Those are the units completed and transferred out, aren't they? Okay, and then we do what? We subtract out or those were the units started for the period, started for the period, and then to get the units started and completed, we do what? To get the units transferred, I should say. Yeah. Units started and completed are going to be what? We're going to have to take out the ending inventory. That gives me the units transferred, and then I can go ahead and add in the equivalent units. Okay? Okay. Let's take a look at this one. And so this one has what? Has during March, the production department and process operations system completed and transferred to finished goods 25,000 units that were in process at the beginning of March. 110,000 units were started and completed. Again, a little bit of a different way of describing that, but I have to know to what? To take the 125, the 25 plus the 110 to get 135,000 that were completed and transferred out. Then I do what? Then I go ahead and I figure out my equivalent units for my ending work in process. And they tell me, and this is the tricky point here, you think, well, equivalent units has to be something less than 100, not if all the materials go in, say, at the beginning, right? So they were 100% done as to materials, so I just take all of the units that were in ending inventory. That gives me equivalent units of 165. I take my cost in beginning and cost added for the period, divided by my equivalent units, and that gives me my cost per equivalent unit. Okay? So the point of these different questions is you have to get used to some of the reading comprehension, understand what's going on here. Okay? This one is, I believe, similar but a little bit different. Here they tell me production department process operations system completed and transferred to finished goods 65,000. So here they just give me that number, right? Okay, so I pick that up. That's 100% complete as to the, what are they asking me? Materials. Okay. Then what? Then they say 15,000 units were in process and production department were 80% complete. 15,000 times the 80%. I pick up, again, the cost what? In beginning inventory and the cost added for the period to get my cost per equivalent unit. So it really depends to a large extent on how they've described what's gone on with these. Okay? Okay, so that gets us through weighted average, and I'm pretty sure most of the questions that are in the quiz for Chapter 4 are all for, I'll call it 4A, are also the ones that I've embedded here that we've looked at. But if you go through that quiz, you see some additional ones. Take a look at those, and then we can talk about those next time if you have questions on those. So you've had some chance to work with those, or if you want to ask about these particular ones after you had a chance to look at them, that's fine too. Okay, I want to move us on to, any question about this right now? Okay, so I'm going to move us on to Fifo. Okay, so let's look at Fifo now. And the big difference between weighted average and Fifo, and like I said, the big challenge is holding them both in your head at the same time. Neither of them are individually hard. It's just transferring from your left foot to your right foot depending on which method you're using. Okay, so you have to have that flexibility to be able to do that properly. But the big difference with Fifo is that Fifo does not assume work that was done in the previous period was done this period. So we only give ourselves credit for what we've done this period. So now that percentage I told you to stay away from in the weighted average becomes relevant if we're talking about Fifo. So if they tell us that the goods were 40% complete at the beginning of the period, that means we did what? That means we did 60% of the work this period, right? And we'll only give ourselves credit for that 60%. In weighted average, we just assume we did all that work this period, right? Okay. The other big difference is how we treat the cost. instead of picking up the cost in the beginning inventory, we will only pick up the costs that were added this period in calculating our cost per equivalent unit. That's the big difference. Okay, so let's just go ahead and take a look. And under Fifo, the ending inventory is priced at the cost of manufacture during the period, assuming that the beginning inventory was completed during the period. So the equivalent units calculation, completion of units on hand at the beginning of the period, whatever that percentage is. Units started and completed during the period are going to be what? The units that were started, the units that were completed minus whatever amount was already in beginning inventory, because we're going to give ourselves credit only for that work that was done at the beginning of the period, right? I mean, not that was done at the beginning period, that was done during the period, right? So we have to back out the total of what was in beginning inventory to get the units started and completed during the period. And then, just like we do for weighted average, we give ourselves credit for any work on ending inventory that was done this period. That part doesn't change. Okay? Cost components only include what? Cost components only include the costs added this period. That part's pretty easy. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look. And they give us this fact pattern. You're saying, but John, I thought we were using Fifo here, but just see how it would have been done under weighted average. Units completed and transferred out were 600. We do what? We take the equivalent units of the ending inventory. We're done, right? Okay, but notice here they tell us that what? 25% was completed already on the beginning inventory when the period started. That means we did how much of the work this period? Good, 75%. Excellent. Got done this period. So what do? We take the 100 times the 75. We've accounted for the beginning inventory, haven't we? Then we pick up the units completed and transferred out, but we have to back out the 100 that were in beginning inventory because we only gave ourselves credit for 75 equivalent units this period, right? Not the full 100. So we back that out. That gives us the units started and completed, right? And then just like we did under weighted average, we give ourselves credit for whatever work we've done on the ending inventory, right? It's a little different approach. Like I said, neither of these are hard. It's just the hard part is staying flexible enough to go from one method to the other, because on your exam I could ask you FIFO versus weighted average, right? Okay, and then under weighted average we pick up what? Beginning and current cost. Under FIFO we just pick up the current cost, right? All right, two big differences. The two big differences: how we handle the units, how do we handle the cost. And it's the beginning units that differ. Okay. All right. So let's just go ahead and let's do this problem, and let's go ahead and kind of do it together. I stole this from the Becker material because I think it probably is the easiest way for us to look at, and I'm still working on getting this. It shouldn't be a problem to get us the whole BEC section for us to study with, so you'd have all the questions like this. But I borrowed a couple from Becker. I don't think they mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look. Beginning work in process was 16,000 units, right? And they tell us that the beginning work in process was 60% complete. That means then that we did what? That we completed how much this period? 40%. So we're going to take that 16,000. Just going to write it again down here. Times what? Times 0.4 means that on an equivalent unit basis, we did work on 6,400 units this period, that beginning inventory. Then what? Started in production, completed. If we want to get the units that were what? Started and completed this period, we have to take the 92,000, but we have to do what? Subtract out the 16,000 because we already accounted for those 16,000 up there, didn't we? So when we subtract those out, we get what, 76,000? right? Okay. Then what? Then when we get to the ending inventory, it's just like weighted average, right? It's going to be the 24,000. And what was the percent here? They tell us that they were what? Ending inventory was 90% complete. What are we looking at? Are we looking at materials here? Right? So we take the 24,000 times 0.9. That gives me 21,600. Which gives me what? 104,000. Question? Okay, good. Now when you look at this question, same fact pattern, but now they want us to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. Question? They want us to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. So what number should I pick up here? Cost per equivalent unit for material. What number do you want me to pick up here? Huh?
It'll be your 54,560 plus 20,320 plus the 15,240.
Okay, first of all, we're looking at materials, so we're not going to pick up any of these labor costs, right? We're just looking at materials, right? You have to come up with a separate number for materials versus labor because they have different equivalent units, right? This one's just asking me for materials. And what number do you want me to pick up?
4,560 plus 4,680.
Okay, that would be correct if we were under weighted average. Under what? Under FIFO, we just pick up the cost added for the period, right? See what I mean about holding them both in your head at the same time? Okay, that's the tricky part because I don't know. I think that our brains are not designed to hold conflicting things in our heads at the same time, right? Because one doesn't bring it in and one does bring in the beginning inventory. Okay, FIFO does not, right? The beginning inventory costs. So they're kind of like opposite of each other, right? For the what? For the weighted average, you just bring everything in and assume it was all done this period, right? And so you use all the costs. I don't know if they're kind of opposite each other. For the FIFO, because you're only giving yourself credit for the work you did this period, then you only pick up the costs that were added this period, right? Maybe that helps make a little more sense. Okay, so we go ahead and we're just going to pick up what? 468,000. Divide that by what? By the equivalent units, which we figured out in the previous problem, 104,000. Right? That gives us what? 450. Does that math work? Okay. Which method do you like better? Weighted average or FIFO? FIFO? Okay, good. That's your accountant's true accountant is now coming out in you, okay? Because the preferred method is FIFO. Most goods process through a system in a first out manner, first in, first out manner, don't they? Okay, and so that being the case, the preferred method is FIFO. Weighted average, though, is acceptable, assuming it's not, distorting significantly the financial information. But FIFO would be the preferred method. Want to try one more? Okay. So number of equivalent units using FIFO. And they tell me that we did what? Units started in production were 150. Units completed were 140. I'm what? 70% complete at the beginning of the period for my beginning inventory. That means at this period I did how much work on those 10,000 units? 30%, 10,000 times 3 is going to be 3,000. Okay, then what? Then I take the 140 units completed, but included in there are the 10,000 that were already in process at the beginning of the period, right? So I have to subtract those out. So I really started and completed 130 units, right? 130,000 units. Okay, and then just like I did for a whatchamacallit weighted average, now I give myself credit for what I've done this period on the ending inventory. 20,000 times what? 0.25. That gives me 5,000. So I guess this answer is 138,000. Okay. Question.
Oh, 5,000. So 3,000 was complete.
10,000 units, 70% complete means I did 30% of the work this period, right? 10,000 units, 70% complete, that means I did 30% of the work this period, right? 30% times 10,000 is 3,000. If I started, if I completed, I should say 140,000 units. I completed the ones first in, first out. I must have completed the ones first that were already in beginning inventory, right? So I have to subtract those beginning inventory units out because I've already accounted for those with that 3,000 number, right? So I back those out. That gives me the units started and completed is 130. And then I give myself credit for any work I've done on the ending inventory, which is the same thing we did for weighted average. Question. Okay, look back at the quiz for chapter 4. Is our midterm next week? When is our midterm? Week after that? Okay, so what I need to do then is I need to put up the practice midterms. So what I'll do is I'll put 2 practice midterms up, and next time we'll grind through those 2 practice midterms until we're saying, stop, I've had enough. Okay, so that's what we'll do next time, and then we'll take the quiz, right? I mean the actual midterm, the class after that. Okay, so right now you can see that this first midterm, guys, is an opportunity to get off to a very good start in this class, right? Because Chapter 1A was hardly anything. Chapter 1B was simply what? Figuring out how to come up with a good predictor of the predetermined overhead rate. Chapter 2-3 was simply using that number to apply overhead to our work in process and what? Doing that in job order, costing, and now process costing, and the big deal in process costing is how to deal with these equivalent units. Okay, and we'll do the practice midterm next time. All right, guys, that's it. That's all I got. Make sure you signed in.
Oh, okay.
Can I take a look of the page